Frank Bellamy dropped to his knees in the wet October grass and felt his own heart stumble like a horse missing a step. The old German shepherd had led him 6 blocks past the shuttered hardware store, past the library with its dark windows, all the way up the long hill to Maple Grove Cemetery, and now lay curled against a small grey stone, as though he had been doing it for months. Frank read the name carved into the granite and could not breathe. Before we go on, tell me in the comments what part of the world you're listening from, and hit subscribe so stories like this one always find you. Rain tapped the windows of Bellamy's bakery long before dawn, the way it always did in Millbrook, Ohio, when the season began its slow slide toward winter. Frank was 58 years old, though most mornings he felt closer to 70, and he had been shaping loaves at the same wooden bench for 31 of those years. He knew the sound of the ovens, the way another man might know the voice of his own child. He also knew, without turning, when a body was standing at the back door of his kitchen. That morning, the sound was different. It was not the delivery boy from the flour mill. It was not the postman with his early sack. It was a soft, careful scratch, low on the door, the kind of scratch that came from something that did not want to wake anybody. Frank set his rolling pin down, wiped his hands on the flour-stiff apron across his belly, and opened the door. The dog stood in the alley light, grey around the muzzle, one ear notched at the tip, coat damp with the last hour of rain, and eyes so patient that Frank forgot for a second where he was. Neither of them moved. Then the dog sat down on the wet concrete step and waited, the way a customer waits at a counter who already knows what he wants, but is too polite to say it first. Frank went back inside without a word. He came out with a warm biscuit, one of the small round ones he made for children who came in with their grandmothers, and he set it on the step between them. The dog did not lunge. He did not gulp. He lowered his grey head and ate the way an animal eats who has, at some point in his life, been asked to have manners at a kitchen. Then he drank a little rainwater from the puddle under the drain pipe, looked up at Frank once and turned away. Frank watched him limp down the alley toward Main Street. He was still watching when the dog turned the corner by the closed dry cleaners and disappeared into the last dark of the morning. It was the first time. By the 7th morning, Patricia was standing at the top of the back stairs in her old blue robe, with her arms folded across her chest, and she was saying the thing she had been saying for 4 days already. "He will stop coming, Frank, if you stop feeding him. That is what stray dogs do. They move on. They find somebody else." Frank kept shaping loaves. Patricia did not know that he had already tried. On the 4th morning, he had left the door closed and stood behind it with his hand on the latch, listening to that same careful scratch. Once, then twice, then quieter, then nothing at all. He had waited 5 minutes and cracked the door open, and the dog had already gone. Frank had spent the next hour with his chest so tight he had to sit on the flour barrel and count breaths. The next morning, he had opened the door with a biscuit in his hand at 3:59, and the dog had been sitting there as though he had never doubted him. "Patricia," Frank said without turning around, "he isn't a stray. He hasn't got a home. That's a different thing." Patricia said nothing for a while. Frank could feel her looking at his back, the way she had looked at his back on the morning of the funeral, 2 winters before, when he had stood at the kitchen window and refused to turn around, because he knew that if he turned around, he would have to see her face, and he did not think he could survive that. "Frank," she said now, gentler, "we can't take another one home. Not now. I'm not taking him home. I'm giving him a biscuit. That is how it starts. That is how everything worth doing starts, Patty." She went back upstairs. Frank shaped the last loaf, slid the tray into the oven, and set the timer with a hand that only shook a little. By the 3rd week, the whole town of Millbrook was talking. Doris Halloran, who ran the bookstore across the street, stood at the bakery counter with her hands flat on the glass and told Frank in her too loud voice that she had seen the dog at 4 in the morning 3 times now, on her way home from her sister's. And if Frank was going to keep a dog, he ought to keep a dog and stop making a scene of it. Ed Wexler, the postman, said the dog crossed Main Street with more sense than half the people in town, waiting at the curb for the one truck that came through before dawn, then trotting on his own timing. Marlene Kittredge, who worked the counter at the pharmacy, said her nephew had followed the dog once for 3 blocks on his skateboard and lost him near the freight yard. Nobody had ever seen the dog after 7 in the morning. Nobody had ever seen him in the afternoon. Nobody could find where he slept. He appeared at 4, ate his biscuit, drank his little water, and was gone by 4:15 down the same 6 blocks toward the old railroad tracks. Frank started keeping records. Not fancy ones. A pencil on the back of an old order pad, what the dog ate, what he drank, whether he limped worse on the left or the right, whether his cough sounded wet or dry. He wrote them down the way another man might have written down a grandchild's weight. He hung a small tag on a strip of old apron cloth around the dog's neck one Tuesday, tied loose so it would not scare him. The tag had the bakery's phone number scratched into it with the tip of a nail. The phone did not ring. Not that Tuesday. Not that week. Not ever. Frank called every shelter within 50 miles. He drove to 2 of them on his day off, the small one in Coshocton and the bigger one over in Zanesville. And he sat with strangers in offices with cracked linoleum floors and described the dog until his own voice sounded like somebody else's. No matches, no microchip scans he could offer because he could not catch the dog long enough to hold him still. The dog let Frank touch him now, one hand between the shoulders, but the moment Frank tried anything with 2 hands, the dog stepped politely back and looked at him like a man declining a favor he had not asked for. On the 18th morning, a woman came into the bakery who Frank had never seen before. She was small, in her 40s, with a coat too thin for the weather and hair pulled back so tight it made her forehead look painful. She stood in the doorway until the little bell above it had finished ringing, and then she said, "I hear you have my dog." Frank set down the tray he was carrying. Patricia at the register went still in a way that Patricia went still when she was already deciding not to like somebody. "I have a dog that visits me," Frank said. "I don't have any dog that's mine. Grey German Shepherd, old, notch out of the left ear." "Right ear," Patricia said without looking up. The woman's mouth twitched, then reset. "Right ear." "Yes, that was what I meant." She reached into her coat pocket. "I have a photo." She laid the photo on the counter. Frank looked at it. It was a picture of a German Shepherd, grey around the muzzle, but younger, standing on a porch that could have been any porch in America, with a rope leash in one corner of the frame and a hand holding it that was clearly the hand of a man, not a woman. "That's not the same dog," Patricia said. "It is," the woman said. "It's older now." "Who took the picture?" Frank asked. "My husband." "Where's your husband?" "He passed." "When?" The woman blinked. 2 years ago." Frank looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "What's the dog's name?" She hesitated 1/2 second too long. "Buddy." Frank picked up the photo and looked at it again. He turned it over. Nothing on the back. He set it down between them like a card being played in a game he did not want to be playing. "Ma'am," he said, "the dog comes by at 4 in the morning. If you leave me your address, I'll bring him to you tomorrow evening, assuming he lets me. I've never gotten a leash on him. I can come pick him up here. Tomorrow evening. My address is fine. Yours." She stared at him. Then she wrote a street name and a house number on the back of the receipt Patricia slid across to her, and she left without buying anything. Patricia waited until the bell finished ringing. "Frank." "I know." "Frank." "I said I know, Patty." He put on his coat. He drove to the address after the bakery closed at noon. The house was there. The number was there. Nobody named on the mailbox that matched the name the woman had scrawled at the bottom of the receipt. Frank knocked. An elderly man opened the door in a bathrobe and said, No, there was no woman here by that name. There was no dog. There had never been a dog. He was allergic, and he lived alone." Frank drove home the long way. He passed the freight yard on the way and slowed the truck and looked down the gravel access road toward the tin roof of an old rail worker's shack, where the town said nothing had lived since the line closed in 1993, and he thought for the first time that he might have to follow the dog himself if he was ever going to understand what he was looking at. The next morning, he sat awake in the kitchen from 3 until 3:59. When the scratch came at the door, he opened it, gave the dog his biscuit, waited for him to drink, and then, when the dog turned to go, Frank pulled on his coat and stepped out into the alley behind him at a distance of 40 feet. The dog stopped once at the corner and looked back at him. He did not look surprised. He looked, if anything, patient. Then he turned and kept walking. Frank followed for 2 blocks. At the 3rd block, a delivery truck rolled through the intersection, and Frank had to wait. And by the time it had passed, the dog was gone. Frank spent an hour walking the sidewalks by the freight yard in the grey pre-dawn, and he found nothing, and he went home and pretended to Patricia that he had gone out for milk. The next day, Marla came back. That was her name, Marla Weeks. Frank found it out because when she stormed into the bakery for the 2nd time at 10 in the morning with a red face and a story about how Frank had refused to bring her dog back, Ed Wexler happened to be sorting the day's 2nd delivery of mail on the bench outside. And Ed had a memory for names the way some men have a memory for baseball scores. Ed came in 10 minutes after she left, dropped the small stack of bills and circulars on Patricia's counter, and said quietly, "Frank, that woman, Marla Weeks, she was in Newark last fall trying to claim a beagle from a family on Elm Street whose granddaughter had just died. Same story, same photo trick. My cousin is a sheriff's deputy over there. There was a report." Frank went very still. Was there anything done about it? They couldn't prove nothing. She backed off and left town, but I don't like her being in yours. Patricia was already reaching for the phone. The dog did not come the next morning. Frank stood at the door for an hour, with a biscuit going cold in a stainless steel bowl at his feet, and when the sun finally came up grey and thin over the roof of the pharmacy across the street, he took the biscuit inside, sat down on the flour barrel, and cried the way a man of 58 cries when he has been holding something in for a very long time. Patricia came down the stairs in her blue robe, sat on the barrel beside him, and did not say a single word. She just put one hand on the back of his neck and left it there. The dog came back the morning after that. He came back thinner. His hips shook when he sat down. There was a wet, rattling cough that Frank had not heard before, and when the dog drank his water, it took him twice as long as usual because he had to stop and breathe. Patricia brought a blanket down from the linen closet. She laid it on the step. The dog looked at the blanket for a long moment, then stepped very carefully onto it, turned in a slow circle, and lay down. He was still lying there when Frank finished the 6 o'clock loaves. That afternoon, Frank called every shelter he had already called and asked a different question. He asked if any of them had a record, going back 3 years, of an intake and adoption of a young male German Shepherd in the Cleveland area. The 3rd shelter he called said yes. The woman on the phone was called Renee. She had a voice like a school teacher, precise and warm. She said the shelter system pulled up 2 adoptions matching Frank's description in that window. She asked him to hold. She came back and read out 2 names. The first name meant nothing to Frank. The second name was his son's. He must have made a sound because Patricia was at his elbow before he had put the phone down. He sat down on the bench by the register with the receiver still in his hand and Renee's voice still saying, "Hello, sir. Are you there, sir? Is everything all right?" "That's not possible," Frank said at nobody in particular. "Sir, that's not possible. My son." Patricia took the receiver from his hand. She said the polite things. She wrote down the confirmation number and the adoption date on the back of an order pad in her careful bookkeeper's handwriting. She said, "Thank you," 3 times, and hung up. Then she sat down beside her husband on the register bench in the middle of the afternoon, in the middle of their empty bakery, and she said, "Frank, what did you not tell me? "What did you know?" "Nothing," he said. "Patty, I didn't know. I didn't know he had a dog." They sat there for a long time. The details came in pieces over the next week, the way details of a life come in pieces after the life has ended. Jacob Bellamy, aged 29, had adopted a young male German Shepherd from the Cleveland Rescue on the 3rd of July, 3 summers before the current one. He had paid the adoption fee in cash. He had listed his address as an apartment on Whittier Street, which Frank had visited once for coffee and had not visited since because Jacob had insisted on driving down to Millbrook every Sunday for lunch instead. He had checked the box on the form that said he wanted a dog with some age on him, a dog other people had already passed on, a dog the shelter was worried nobody was going to take. Renee had personally handed him a 2-year-old shepherd who had been surrendered by a man in a nursing home. Jacob had knelt in the intake room and let the dog sniff his hand, then his sleeve, then his face, and after 2 minutes, the dog had leaned his weight into Jacob's chest, the way dogs do when they have decided. He had named the dog Scout. Frank had never heard the name. Jacob had been living with 2 roommates that year, a young man named Kyle Farrow and a young woman named Emily Chen, both of whom worked at a non-profit that ran community gardens in the city's east side. He had never brought the dog home to Millbrook, though he had planned to. He had planned to bring the dog for Thanksgiving, the last Thanksgiving. Patricia had asked him on the phone one Sunday if he was going to bring anybody special. He had said yes, actually, and laughed and would not tell her who. He had wanted it to be a surprise. On the 18th of November, 4 days before the Thanksgiving he had planned, Jacob had been driving north on Route 6 in an early snow. A truck coming south had hit a patch of black ice at the top of a shallow rise and had crossed the yellow line. The truck driver had lived. Jacob had not. The car was towed. His wallet was returned. His clothes were returned. Nobody had asked about a dog because nobody in Millbrook had known there was a dog. At Jacob's apartment in Cleveland, 90 miles north, Kyle Farrow had been the one who took the call from the police at 11 in the morning on a Tuesday. He had left the apartment inside of 10 minutes without locking the back door because he was 26 years old and the world had just stopped making sense. He had driven to the hospital in Millbrook and had not come home for 2 days. When he came home, the back door was standing open, the screen banging in the wind, and Scout was gone. Kyle had searched. Emily had searched. They had put up flyers on every telephone pole between Whittier Street and Lake Erie. They had called the shelters. Nobody had seen the dog. After 6 weeks, the flyers had faded in the winter rain. After 6 months, Emily had moved to Chicago. Kyle had stayed in the apartment for another year because he could not bring himself to leave, and then he had moved to a smaller place in Lakewood. And he had told himself the dog was dead, that a dog Scout's age with no chip and no collar and no home and Cleveland winters could not have lived. And he had allowed himself to grieve that separately on top of everything else. Frank learned all of this from a young man in a green jacket who arrived at the bakery on a Saturday morning, 3 days after the phone call to Renee. Kyle had driven down from Lakewood the moment Renee called him. He came into the bakery, stopped in the middle of the floor, saw the dog lying on the blanket beside the counter with his grey head on his paws, and made a sound Frank hoped never to hear another human being make. Scout raised his head. He looked at Kyle. He did not get up. He did not wag his tail. He simply looked in the long, exhausted way old dogs look when they have already spent most of the joy they had left. Then he lowered his head back onto his paws and closed his eyes. Kyle sat down cross-legged on the floor of the bakery in front of the counter and cried without making any noise at all. Patricia came out from behind the register, sat down beside him on the tile, and held his hand like she had known him for 20 years. That was the morning the story stopped being about a dog and started being about a family. Kyle drank 2 cups of Frank's coffee before he could speak in whole sentences. When he did, his voice was hoarse, like a voice that had gone up into the attic of him and had only just come back down. "I looked for him," he kept saying. "I looked for him for a year. I put up flyers. I walked every alley in East Cleveland." "I know you did, son," Frank said. "I thought he was dead." "You had every reason to." Kyle looked at the dog. Scout had not moved. His flank rose and fell in the slow, careful way of a dog whose lungs were not new anymore. "He was Jacob's whole thing that summer," Kyle said. "He carried him around like a baby. He used to hold him on his lap in the porch chair and read him the sports section out loud. He said Scout liked the way the paper crinkled." He wiped his face with the back of his hand. "I'm sorry. I never met you. Jacob talked about you all the time, about the bakery. He said the biscuits here were the best in Ohio and it wasn't up for debate." Frank's throat closed. Patricia put a hand on his shoulder and squeezed once. "I think that's why he came," Kyle said. "Scout. I think he was looking for the smell. Jacob used to come home from Sunday lunches with the smell of your bread on his jacket, and Scout would go crazy for it. He'd bury his face in Jacob's collar." "Cleveland is 90 miles from here," Patricia said quietly. "I know. How does a dog walk 90 miles? "He doesn't walk it in one go," Kyle said. "He walks it in pieces, 2 years of pieces. Somebody feeds him. He gets sick. He stops. He starts again. He follows a smell that he doesn't have a word for. That's what dogs do." Frank stood up. He walked to the front window of the bakery and looked out at the wet November street, at the closed sign hanging inside the glass of the pharmacy, at the awning over the bookstore where Doris was already turning her lights on for the day. "He didn't come to the door," he said without turning around. "Not for the first week, not until the 7th morning. Where was he those other weeks?" "I don't know," Kyle said. "I know," Patricia said, and both men turned to look at her. She was staring at the blanket on which Scout was lying, and there was something in her eyes that Frank had not seen in 2 winters, something like a woman finally allowing herself to think a thing she had been refusing to think. "He was up at the cemetery," she said. "Wasn't he?" Nobody answered. "He was up there," she said again, quieter. "He was up there with Jacob. And when winter started coming in, he started coming down for food because he couldn't survive up there anymore. And the only door in this whole town that opens at 4 in the morning is your door, Frank." Frank did not turn around. He looked out at the street and at the pharmacy sign and at the awning over the bookstore, and he made a small sound in his throat that was not quite a word. That night, Frank did not sleep. Patricia did not sleep either. They sat in the kitchen upstairs, at the little wooden table where they had eaten most of the important meals of their lives, and they made a list on the back of an envelope. Vet appointment, blankets in the bakery, a stainless steel bowl by the stove instead of outside on the step, a folder for whatever paperwork Kyle could dig up, groceries, chicken, the good kind, rice. "He may not make it, Patty," Frank said once without looking up from the list. "Then he doesn't make it here," Patricia said, "in the warm, with his people." She said the word people, not person. Frank looked at her over the envelope, and for the first time in 2 winters, something in her face was not held rigid. Dr. Ramirez at the veterinary clinic on Route 12 had been Patricia's cousin's classmate in high school, and now looked so much older than a man that age should look that Frank thought he might be looking at himself. Dr. Ramirez lifted Scout carefully onto the examination table, listened to his chest with a look that started as professional and turned, over the course of 2 minutes, into something else. He palpated the belly. He looked at the gums. He asked Frank how old the dog was. "About 5, Frank said, according to the paperwork." Dr. Ramirez blinked. "This dog is not 5. He was adopted at 2, 3 summers ago. That makes him 5. "Frank," Dr. Ramirez said, "this dog is closer to 9. Maybe older. Whoever gave him to your boy told your boy a story. This dog has the joints of a 9-year-old shepherd. He has the heart of an older one. He has the eyes of an older one. He shook his head. It doesn't matter. He is what he is. He drew blood. He took X-rays. He came back into the small room where Frank and Patricia sat on plastic chairs and closed the door behind him. He sat down on the little rolling stool with his back very straight, and he told them the truth the way a good vet always does, without dressing it up. Advanced cardiac disease, arthritis in both hips, a mass in the abdomen that he could not tell them yet was benign or otherwise without more tests, a cough that was not going anywhere good, weeks probably, 2, 3, maybe 4 if they were lucky, and the weather was gentle. "He isn't in pain," Dr. Ramirez said. "Not the way you're picturing. He is tired. He has been tired for a long time. What he needs now is warm and quiet and somebody sitting near him." Patricia was crying without moving any part of her face. Frank reached over and took her hand, and it fit in his the way it had at 17. "Is there a chip in him?" Frank asked. "There is a chip. It's not registered to a current owner. The last record on it is the Cleveland shelter." "Can we register it to us?" "You can. I'll do it today. We'll transfer him under your name before we close." "Then do it," Frank said. The papers were signed at 4 in the afternoon. Scout was officially, in the eyes of every database in the state of Ohio, the property of Frank and Patricia Bellamy of Bellamy's Bakery, 362 Main Street, Millbrook. The next morning at 4, Frank did not put the stainless steel bowl on the step. He set it beside the stove, on a folded towel, and when the scratch came at the door, he opened it and did not say anything but the dog's name for the first time. "Come in, Scout," he said. Scout looked at him. Then he looked at the bowl. Then he looked, for a long second, at the space beyond Frank's knees, at the warm kitchen with its ovens humming and its lights soft in the dark. He stepped over the threshold with a care that made Frank's throat hurt. He walked to the bowl on his old shaking legs. He lowered his grey head. He ate. He did not leave for the cemetery that morning. He lay down on the folded towel by the stove after his water, and he closed his eyes, and he slept. And every time Frank came near him to open the oven, or slide a tray out, or pull a proofing basket down from the shelf, Scout's ears twitched once, and then settled as if to say, "Yes, I know you, and I am glad you are here." By the end of the first week, the bakery had a second stool behind the counter, a low one, because customers had begun to sit on the floor to say hello to Scout, and Patricia had decided that was not dignified and had asked Ed Wexler's brother, who did carpentry on weekends, to build her something smaller and closer to the ground. Scout accepted the stool the way he accepted everything else that happened to him now, with a slow, patient lowering of his head, as though every gift was a thing he had been waiting for a very long time and did not need to make a fuss about. The town noticed. Doris Halloran came in on the 10th day with a knit blanket she had made herself, thick and green, with a border of what she called shepherd colors, which was grey and gold. Marlene at the pharmacy sent over a small bottle of joint supplement with a handwritten note that said, "On the house, and don't argue with me about it, Frank." Ed Wexler brought a folded, laminated photograph of Jacob standing outside the community garden in Cleveland the summer before he died, one hand on Scout's head, both of them laughing about something the camera had not caught. Kyle had mailed it. It went up on the wall behind the register, next to the framed newspaper clipping about the bakery's 50th anniversary and the wooden plaque that said, in Patricia's father's handwriting from 1966, "Kindness is the only leaven that never fails." Then, on the 14th day, Marla came back. She did not come into the bakery. She came in with paperwork. The animal control officer stood at the door with his hat in his hand at 8 in the morning. He was a young man Frank had known since the boy was in Little League, a Wexler cousin twice removed, and he looked as though he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. Behind him, on the sidewalk, stood Marla Weeks in the same too-thin coat, with her arms crossed and a look of small, satisfied fury on her face. "Mr. Bellamy," the officer said, "I hate to do this. I got a complaint filed, improperly registered stray, public health concern. I have to check paperwork." Frank stepped aside without a word. He brought out the folder. Adoption transfer, microchip registration, vaccination records from the rush appointment Dr. Ramirez had squeezed in the day after the diagnosis. Bill of sale from the Cleveland shelter, 3 years old, in his son's name, with the transfer to Frank stapled behind it. The officer read every page, twice. He looked up at Frank, at Patricia, at the dog lying on the green knit blanket by the stove. He looked out at Marla on the sidewalk. "Ma'am," he called, "would you come inside, please?" Marla came inside. She stood in the middle of the shop with her chin up and her jaw tight. "Ma'am," the officer said, "the dog is registered. The dog is chipped. The dog has vaccinations current as of yesterday. The dog has a home. This is a complete file. What's the basis of the complaint?" "That's not the same dog on that chip," Marla said. "That chip is for a different dog. This is my dog." "Ma'am, the chip in the animal was scanned by the veterinarian yesterday. The chip number matches the paperwork. This is the dog on the file." Then somebody switched chips. The officer looked at Frank. Frank looked at Patricia. Patricia looked at Marla, and Patricia, without raising her voice, said, "Ma'am, I would like to ask you one question. What was your husband's name?" Marla's mouth opened. It closed. It opened again. "Ma'am," the officer said gently, "what was your husband's name?" She turned and walked out. She was arrested on the corner of Main and 4th by Sheriff Danny Kittredge, Marlene's older brother and Frank's classmate from the class of 1986, who had been sitting in his cruiser across the street for the last 20 minutes on the request of Ed Wexler. She had 4 outstanding warrants in 3 counties, all for fraud against grieving families. The bakery watched through the front window as Danny put her gently into the back of the cruiser and drove her away. Nobody in the shop said anything for a long time. Then Doris Halloran, who had been standing at the counter with her hand on the glass, said, "Well, I suppose I owe Ed Wexler an apology. I always said he had too much time on his hands." The days after Marla went to jail were the quietest days Frank had lived in a long time. Scout ate. Scout slept. Scout let Frank kneel beside him 3 or 4 times a day to press his face into the grey ruff at the shoulder and breathe in the smell of him, which was not the smell of a stray or the smell of a rescue, but the smell of a dog who had, for a long time, been loved by somebody who was not there anymore. Patricia sat on the floor by the stove in the afternoons with her knitting in her lap and pretended she was working on a sweater for her sister's grandson, but Frank saw her more than once put the needles down and put her hand flat against Scout's ribs and hold it there without moving, as though she were listening to a phone call that only she could hear. Kyle came down on the 3rd weekend with a cardboard box. Inside the box were things nobody had had the heart to throw away. A leash, blue nylon, chewed at the handle where Scout had gotten hold of it as a young dog. A rubber ball, cracked, a collar with a small brass tag that said, on one side, Scout, and on the other side, an address on Whittier Street in Cleveland that did not exist anymore. A folded flannel shirt of Jacob's, grey and red plaid, that Kyle said Scout had used as a bed for a whole summer. Frank held the shirt to his face for a long time and did not speak. Patricia took the collar into the back of the shop and washed it in warm, soapy water and dried it on a soft cloth and brought it back and buckled it around Scout's neck herself. Scout stood for the buckling with his ears half back, as though he remembered the weight of something around his throat and had been missing it. The dog turned his head once and licked Patricia's wrist. Patricia sat down on the floor of the bakery and put both arms around him, and she cried in a way she had not cried in 2 winters. Frank stood at the counter with his hand on the register and did not move, because he understood at last that he was watching a wall come down in his wife that he had believed would stand forever. That night at the kitchen table upstairs, Patricia said, "I want to go up there." Frank looked at her. To the cemetery, she said. I haven't been. Not since. You know I haven't. I know. I want to go up there and I want to take Scout. Patty, the vet said 2-3 weeks. He isn't strong enough to walk it. Then we drive. Frank thought about this for a long time. He looked at his wife across the wooden table with the same water stain in the corner from the leak they had fixed in 1998. He thought about the shape of her face, and the shape of the last 2 winters, and the shape of what a wall coming down looks like when the wall has been holding up the whole house. All right, he said. Sunday, if the weather holds. The weather did not hold. The Saturday before, the first hard freeze of the season came in from the north, and on Sunday morning the streets of Millbrook were silver with frost, and the sky was low and iron. Scout got up from his blanket slower than he had gotten up in a week. His breath rattled on the exhale. He drank a little water and lay back down. Not today, Patricia said low. Not in this cold. Next weekend, Frank said. I promise. Scout closed his eyes. He slept the whole morning. Frank and Patricia sat with him on the floor of the bakery in shifts, one of them at the counter while the other was on the floor. And by afternoon, Scout was breathing easier again and even lifted his head to accept a small piece of chicken from Patricia's hand. But that night, when Frank came downstairs to check on him at midnight, Scout was standing at the back door. He was not scratching. He was not asking to go out. He was simply standing there with his grey head lowered and his ears forward, looking at the door the way a dog looks at a thing he intends to walk through. Frank came up beside him. He knelt down slowly, one hand on the doorframe for balance, because he was 58, and his knees were 58 also. Not tonight, old man, he said. It's too cold. Come back to your blanket. Scout looked at him. There was, in that look, no argument and no protest. There was only a very tired, very patient assertion that a thing needed doing. Frank had lived in the world long enough to know when he was being told, gently by an animal, that the animal had made up his mind. He put on his coat, he put on his boots. He went upstairs and woke Patricia, and Patricia did not ask a single question. She dressed, she came down. She wrapped Scout in the green knit blanket from Doris. Frank picked him up in both arms, all 58 pounds of him, and carried him out to the pickup truck. The heater took a moment to warm. They drove through the empty streets of Millbrook with the frost cracking under the tires, past the shuttered hardware store, past the library with its dark windows, past the closed dry cleaners and the pharmacy sign and the awning over the bookstore, past the hollow bones of the freight yard, where the tin roof of the old rail worker's shack shone dully in the moonlight, and Frank thought briefly that he would come back one day and look inside that shack for the nest of newspaper and coats he suspected was still there. Then up the long hill to Maple Grove Cemetery. The gate was locked at night, but the gate had been locked for as long as the cemetery had existed, and every child who grew up in Millbrook knew the low spot in the fence where the ground had sunk into a small culvert. Frank parked the truck. He carried Scout. Patricia walked ahead with a flashlight from the truck's toolbox. Together in the pale white glow of a November moon, the three of them made their slow way across the frost-silvered grass to the small stone near the back fence. Frank set Scout down on the green blanket in front of the stone. Scout lay with his chin on his paws. He was breathing hard. His flank rose and fell as though he had walked, not been carried. He looked up once at the stone, and then he looked at Frank. And then he lowered his head onto the blanket and closed his eyes. Frank knelt in the frozen grass. He read the name on the stone as if he had never read it before. Jacob Bellamy, 18th of November, aged 29 years. Patricia knelt beside him. She reached out with both hands and pressed her palms flat against the granite for the first time in 2 winters, and she did not say anything, because there was nothing left to say that had not been said inside her every day for 731 days. Frank spoke, quietly, not to the stone. He told Jacob about the bakery. He told Jacob about the ovens, which were the same ovens Jacob had grown up in front of. He told Jacob about Doris Halloran's knit blanket, and about Ed Wexler's memory for names, and about Marla Weeks in the back of Danny Kittredge's cruiser. He told Jacob about the mornings the dog had come to the door at 4 in the morning, and about the biscuits, and about the water bowl by the stove. He told Jacob that he was sorry, more sorry than he had ever been for anything in his life, that he had not known about the dog, that if he had known, he would have driven to Cleveland the day after the funeral and put Scout in the truck and brought him home, and Scout would not have had to walk 90 miles in stages over 2 years to find him. Then he stopped talking because he did not have any more words in him. Patricia said, "I forgive you, Jacob." Frank turned to look at her. "For dying," Patricia said without looking at Frank. Her hands were still pressed to the stone. "I know it is a stupid thing to say. I know you did not choose it. I have been so angry with you for 2 years for leaving us, and I did not even know I was angry. And I am so sorry, my baby. I am so sorry." She put her forehead against the stone. Scout at their feet made a small sound. Not a whine, not a whimper, something older and quieter. He shifted his grey head an inch on the blanket, and Frank saw that his eyes were open again, and that they were, in the moonlight, the color of very old amber, and that they were looking at Patricia the way a dog looks at somebody who has finally understood. They stayed there until the sky in the east began to turn the color of raw milk. Then they wrapped Scout in the blanket, and Frank carried him back down the hill to the truck, and they drove home with the heater on high, and Scout asleep between them on the bench seat. He was still breathing. He was still breathing when Frank set him down beside the stove. He was still breathing when Patricia laid the green blanket over him. He was still breathing when Frank opened the ovens at 4 in the morning, and began, for the first time in his life, to shape the day's loaves with a dog he had not known he had at his feet. The winter that came in after that night was one of the coldest winters Millbrook had seen in a decade. The old-timers at the diner across the street said so, and the paper said so, and Frank's pipe said so twice in December when they froze up behind the bathroom wall and had to be thawed with a hairdryer at 3 in the morning. Scout did not walk to the cemetery again. He did not need to. He walked instead from the folded towel by the stove to the low stool behind the counter, and from the low stool to the front door in the middle of the afternoon when he wanted to look at the street through the glass, and from the front door back to the folded towel when he wanted to sleep. He ate small meals 4 times a day now because Dr. Ramirez had said his stomach was not up to big meals anymore. He drank warm broth from the stainless steel bowl at breakfast and cold water from a china dish at dinner. He allowed Doris Halloran to sit on the floor beside him for a full hour every Wednesday when she came over with the little book she was reading, because she had decided, with a firmness that brooked no argument, that Scout enjoyed being read to. Kyle drove down every second weekend. He brought his fiancée, a young woman named Vanessa, who was studying to be a nurse. Vanessa sat on the floor of the bakery with Scout's head in her lap and told Patricia stories about Kyle and Jacob when they had all lived on Whittier Street. Stories that Patricia had never heard, stories that made Patricia laugh in a way that Frank had almost forgotten she could laugh. Kyle, who had inherited Jacob's slow half-smile without ever realizing it, sat with Frank in the back of the bakery and asked, awkwardly, one Saturday whether he could keep coming down after Scout was gone. Because he did not, he said, have any grandparents left. And Frank had looked at him across the flower bench and had said, without any hesitation at all, "Yes, of course, son. This bakery has been standing since 1966. You come as often as you like." The mass in Scout's abdomen was benign. Dr. Ramirez called with the news 2 weeks after the trip to the cemetery, and his voice on the phone was almost apologetic, as though he had been the one who had made the mass grow there in the first place. It did not change the arithmetic. The heart was still what the heart was. The lungs were still what the lungs were. Scout would go when he was ready to go, but he was not going quickly. He was going slowly, at the pace an old dog is allowed to go when he has finally found the fire he was walking to. He made it through Thanksgiving. Patricia cooked a small turkey for the three of them and set a plate of chicken breast on the floor beside her chair, and Scout ate every bite. He made it through Christmas. Kyle brought a wreath from a tree lot in Lakewood and hung it on the back door of the bakery in the place where Scout used to scratch. And Scout looked at it from his towel with what Frank swore later was approval. He made it through New Year's Eve, which the Bellamys spent the way they had spent every New Year's Eve since 1972, in bed by 10, with a small glass of sherry each on the nightstand and the television off. Scout slept in the hallway between their room and the top of the stairs, with the green blanket pulled up to his shoulders and his notched ear turned toward the sound of their breathing. He made it through most of January. On the 21st, a Sunday morning that was grey and windless and warmer than it had any right to be, that late in the winter, Scout did not lift his head when Frank set the stainless steel bowl of warm broth beside him. Frank waited. He waited 5 minutes. He waited 10. Then he sat down on the tile floor beside Scout, with his back against the base cabinet of the counter, and he put his hand on the ribs of the old dog and left it there. Patricia came down the stairs slowly. She had heard from upstairs the exact quality of the silence. She sat down on the tile floor on Scout's other side, and she put her hand next to Frank's, and together they felt the last 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 breaths of an animal who had walked 90 miles over 2 years and 6 blocks every morning for months and 1 long night through a freezing cemetery, all to find them. He went easy. There was no gasping. There was no rattle at the end. There was only at the very last a small, soft exhale and a stillness that came in the way stillness comes in when a season finishes. Frank did not cry. Patricia did not cry. They sat on the tile floor of the bakery with the dog between them and the Sunday sun coming pale through the front window, and they held each other's eyes across his grey back, and there was, in that small quiet, no grief that did not also contain thanksgiving. They buried him on the following Sunday in the plot Frank had bought in his own name 3 days after the phone call from Renee at Maple Grove Cemetery, in the corner behind the small stone with his son's name on it. Kyle drove down for the service. Vanessa came, Doris came, Ed came, Marlene came. Danny Kittredge stood at the back of the small group with his sheriff's hat over his heart. Dr. Ramirez stood beside him. The pastor from the little Methodist church on 4th read the 23rd Psalm and 1 verse from the book of Ecclesiastes, and Frank spoke for 2 minutes about what a good scout does when he finds the people who belong together. And then, because he could not go on, he stopped talking, and Patricia stepped up beside him and finished the sentence he had started. "He brings them home," she said, "and then he stays." They put a small stone next to Jacob's. It said, in letters no larger than a child's hand, "Scout, he found us." The bakery did not stay the way it had been. In the spring after Scout died, on a morning when the first crocuses were pushing up through the mulch under the bakery's front window, a young woman Frank did not recognize came into the shop with a reporter's notebook and a small tape recorder and asked if he had a moment to talk. Her name was Amelia Voss. She wrote for a small paper in Cleveland that had, she said, picked up on the story from a piece Kyle had put on a website, and she had driven down that morning because her editor thought there might be a longer article in it. Frank looked at her over the counter for a long moment. Then he said, "Sit down," and he put on a fresh pot of coffee, and he told her the whole thing. The article ran in the Sunday edition of the following week. It was called "The Long Walk Home." It ran to 12 pages, with photographs of the bakery, of the stainless steel bowl by the stove, of the 2 small stones side by side at the back of Maple Grove Cemetery, and of the framed picture of Jacob and Scout on the wall behind the register. A wire service picked it up on Monday. A television crew from Columbus came on Wednesday. By the following Sunday, the bakery had a line out the door before it opened, and people who had never set foot in Millbrook, Ohio, were arriving in cars with license plates from Michigan and Pennsylvania and West Virginia, standing patiently in the alley behind the shop where Scout had first scratched at the door, taking photographs of the door itself with their telephones. Frank did not know what to make of any of it. Patricia did. She had quietly, in the weeks after Scout's burial, been thinking. She had been reading of an evening, on the little laptop the bakery used for its taxes, about a thing called a memorial fund. She had been talking quietly on the telephone to a woman at a rescue organization in Columbus that specialized in placing senior dogs, the dogs nobody wanted, the dogs Jacob had checked the box for on the adoption form. She had, without telling Frank yet, drawn up the paperwork. The evening after the television crew left, Patricia set the paperwork on the kitchen table upstairs and told Frank what she had done. The Bellamy Fund. Every dollar the bakery took in above its ordinary weekly average would go from now on into a small fund that placed senior shelter dogs with older adults who were living alone. There would be no fee to the adopter. There would be a home visit and a follow-up and a promise on both sides that the dog would have a warm place to sleep for whatever days it had left. Patricia had chosen the name. She had chosen the language on the application. She had already, she said, spoken to Danny Kittredge about serving on the small board, and to Dr. Ramirez about providing veterinary services at cost, and to Doris Halloran about running the intake calls, because Doris had, since Scout's death, been going quietly to pieces from lack of anyone to boss around. Frank read the paperwork twice. He looked at his wife. He looked out the kitchen window at the March sky, still winter grey, but with a promise of green at the edges of it, and he said, "Patty, when did you get to be this brave?" "Oh, Frank," Patricia said, "I have always been this brave. I just forgot for a while." She signed the papers. He signed the papers. The Bellamy Fund placed its first senior dog, an 11-year-old black Labrador named Nutmeg, with a widow on Elm Street 2 weeks later. It placed its fourth dog by June. By the following winter, it had placed 22. By the second anniversary of Scout's death, it had placed 113 dogs across 3 counties, and Patricia was traveling once a month to give small talks in library basements about the ways that grief and love, taken together, could build something that neither one of them could have built alone. Marla Weeks pled guilty in a courtroom in Newark, Ohio, in the spring of the same year. She was sentenced to 4 years in a state facility with the possibility of parole after 2. Frank did not attend the sentencing. Patricia did not attend the sentencing. Ed Wexler attended the sentencing because Ed Wexler was that kind of man, and he came back to the bakery and reported quietly that Marla had cried in the courtroom in a way that had not sounded fake, and that the judge had spoken very slowly at the end about how the cruelty of preying on grieving families was a particular kind of cruelty that the state took a particular interest in punishing. Kyle, who had made the drive from Lakewood for the sentencing without telling anyone he was going, said Marla had looked at the last minute over her shoulder at the small group of families she had cheated and had mouthed the words, "I am sorry," and that he thought, though he could not be certain, that at least some of the families had nodded. Frank did not know what to do with any of that either. He wrote it down on the back of an order pad and tucked the paper into the drawer under the register where he kept the important things. Kyle married Vanessa in July of that year, in the community garden in East Cleveland, where he and Jacob had worked together, and Frank and Patricia drove up for the ceremony. There were 70 people there. It was the largest gathering Frank had been to since his own son's funeral. He wore the same dark suit. He stood in the same shape. But when the small band of guitar and mandolin players began the recessional and Kyle and Vanessa walked back down the aisle of folding chairs with their hands linked and their faces open, Frank found that his eyes, for the first time at a large gathering in almost 3 years, were filling up with something other than sorrow. Vanessa's veil caught briefly on the corner of a rose bush at the end of the aisle. Kyle, without breaking stride, reached back and untangled it with the same slow, careful patience with which Frank had once seen Jacob untangle a fishing line at 7 years old on the bank of the Muskingum River. Patricia, beside Frank, made a small sound in her throat. "He walks like Jacob," she said, so quietly that only Frank heard. "He does, Patty. He does." Kyle came over during the reception. He hugged Patricia first for a long time, and then he shook Frank's hand, and, when Frank did not let go, hugged him too. He told them, at the end of the hug, that Vanessa was expecting a baby in November, that they had waited to say anything until after the wedding, that the baby was a boy, and that they were thinking, if the Bellamys did not mind, of naming him Jacob. Frank did not say anything for a moment because he could not. Then he said, "Son, we would be honored." Patricia said, "Only please let his middle name be Frank, because his grandfather is not done being his grandfather yet." Kyle, who had lost his own father at 17, put his face down against Patricia's shoulder and cried without making any noise at all. The baby was born on the 11th of November, 4 days before his grandfather's birthday and 7 days before what would have been his uncle's 32nd. His name on his birth certificate was Jacob Franklin Farrow. Frank drove Patricia to Lakewood the day after the birth in the same pickup truck that had once carried Scout to Maple Grove Cemetery in the middle of a November night. And he sat in an armchair in Kyle and Vanessa's small living room for 2 hours, with the smallest, warmest, most complete weight he had ever held sleeping against his chest. And he did not put the baby down until his arm went numb. And when Vanessa laughed and offered to take the baby back, Frank said quietly, "No, another minute. If you don't mind," because he had waited a long time to hold a Jacob who would grow up. In the winter that followed the placement of that 113th dog, on a Thursday afternoon when the bakery was quiet, Frank finally did the thing he had been putting off for 3 years. He drove the pickup truck down to the old freight yard, parked it beside the collapsing chain-link fence, and walked, in his good winter coat, across the gravel to the tin-roofed rail worker's shack he had never quite been able to bring himself to enter. The door of the shack was not locked. The door of the shack had not had a lock for at least 20 years. Frank pushed it open with the flat of his hand and stood on the threshold and let his eyes adjust to the dim. Inside, the shack was almost bare. Somebody at some point had swept out most of what was in it, or the wind had, or the rain. But in the far corner, tucked up under the workbench where the old brake tester used to sit, there was a nest. Frank knelt down beside it. He put on his reading glasses. The nest was made of newspaper, mostly, layered thick and pressed flat by the weight of a body that had, for what looked like a long time, curled itself into a small ball in this corner every night. There was, folded neatly at the top of the nest, a jacket, grey and red plaid flannel, same size as the one Kyle had brought down in the cardboard box. Not identical, not quite, but close enough, Frank thought, that the animal who had built this nest had probably felt he was close to something he had lost. There was also, tucked into the middle of the newspapers, a chewed rubber ball, cracked at the seam. Frank sat down on the dusty concrete floor of the shack. He held the flannel jacket in his lap for a long time. He thought about the years Scout had spent walking. He thought about the winters and the summers and the roads and the fences, and the strangers who had, without ever knowing why, fed a grey shepherd on a Tuesday and thought no more about it. He thought about the smell of warm flour and about 6 blocks of Main Street at 4 in the morning, and about the long, slow climb up the hill to Maple Grove Cemetery. He thought about his son, who had walked for 29 years and had loved every step of it. Then he folded the jacket, put the ball in his coat pocket, and left the shack for the last time. He drove back to the bakery. He did not tell Patricia where he had been. He hung the jacket in the closet under the stairs. where he had already hung Jacob's other things, and he set the rubber ball on the shelf above the register beside the framed picture of Jacob and Scout, and he did not speak of any of it out loud for the rest of his life. He did not have to. Patricia noticed the ball on the shelf the next morning on her way to the register with the day's till, and she stopped and looked at it for a long time, and then she looked at Frank across the shop. He was slicing a loaf for Doris Halloran. He did not look up. "Frank," Patricia said very quietly. "Yes." "Where did that come from?" "Old friend brought it," Frank said. Patricia smiled a small, tired, grateful smile, and she did not ask any more questions because she understood the language of that particular smile the way she had understood every language her husband had ever spoken to her in 41 years of marriage. The bakery kept its 4 o'clock hour. It kept its stainless steel bowl by the stove. It kept its low stool behind the counter and its framed photograph on the wall and its little brass tag from Whittier Street, which Patricia had polished and mounted in a shadow box beside the register with a small typed card that said simply, "He found his way." 2 years after Scout's death, a woman named Renee from a rescue organization in Cleveland drove down to Millbrook on a Tuesday morning without warning. She had gray at her temples now that had not been there when Frank had spoken to her on the phone, and her eyes had the tired, kind look of women who spent their working lives holding animals that other people had let go. She stood in the middle of the bakery, looked at the framed photograph of Jacob and Scout above the register, and told Frank quietly that she had a young dog in her truck she thought he might want to meet. Frank looked at Patricia. Patricia set down the dish towel she had been folding. "Not to replace anyone," Renee said quickly. "Never. Only, it is a shepherd cross. He is about a year old. His owner passed. The family cannot keep him. He does not do well in the kennel. I thought of you." Frank went outside with her. The dog in the back of the truck was black and tan, with big feet he had not grown into, and a set of ears that stood up so tall they made him look from certain angles like a species not entirely of this planet. He looked at Frank through the kennel door with a set of dark, uncertain eyes. He did not bark. He did not whine. He simply pressed the tip of his nose against the wire and waited. Frank knelt down. "Hello there, friend," he said. The dog put one enormous paw against the kennel door. They took him home that afternoon. Frank had been thinking about the name on the drive back to the bakery, and he had settled on Miller by the time they came up the alley, because Miller was the name of the flour mill that had supplied the bakery since 1966, and Miller sounded like the name of a working dog. Miller lived at the bakery for the next 9 years. He was not Scout, and Frank never once pretended he was. He was his own dog, with his own habits and his own opinions, and his own small collection of chewed rubber balls that the customers brought him. But every morning, at 4 in the morning, when Frank opened the ovens and began to shape the day's loaves, Miller lay on the folded towel by the stove where Scout had lain, and he slept the calm sleep of an animal who had at some point in his young life been introduced to the smell of warm flour and had decided that the smell was the smell of home. Kyle and Vanessa's son, Jacob Franklin Farrow, called Jack by his parents, and Jake by his grandmother Patricia, learned to walk in the bakery. In the summer he turned 1. His first steps were between the low stool and the folded towel by the stove, from Miller's warm side to Patricia's outstretched hand, and every one of the 7 customers in the shop that afternoon stood and applauded, and Patricia laughed until she cried, and then cried until she laughed. On his 6th birthday, he stood on a small wooden crate his grandfather had built for him, and he shaped his first small loaf with his own hands, and Frank, who had shaped tens of thousands of loaves at the same wooden bench, stood behind him with a hand hovering near the small of his back, in case he tipped and thought that there were, perhaps, no bad days in a life, if a life could hold, at any point in it, a morning like this one. Patricia lived to see her 74th birthday. She died in the spring of the 12th year after Scout, quietly in her sleep, in the same bed she had slept in for 48 years, with her husband's hand in hers and the window cracked open to let in the sound of the first robins. Frank buried her in the plot at Maple Grove Cemetery, in the space he had reserved for himself, because he had, on the day of the funeral, decided that he could wait a while longer, and because he wanted Patricia to have the shady spot under the maple tree that she had always said she preferred. Frank kept the bakery open until his 83rd birthday. On the morning of that birthday, at 4 in the morning, he shaped his last loaf. He set it in the oven himself. He waited the 23 minutes for it to bake. He took it out with the same wooden peel he had inherited from his father in 1974. He set the loaf on the counter to cool. Then he took off his apron, folded it 3 times, and hung it on the hook by the back door. And he said, out loud to the empty kitchen, thank you all, and thank you most of all, Scout. He handed the keys that afternoon to a young baker he had hired 7 years before, a soft-spoken young man from Youngstown named Marcus, who had learned to shape the small round biscuits the way Frank shaped them, with the corner of the thumb and the ball of the palm. Frank moved into a small apartment above the bookstore across the street, because he could not bring himself to move out of Main Street entirely. He walked over to the bakery every morning at 4 for coffee, until his knees decided at 85 that 4 in the morning was a young man's game, and then he walked over at 6. He held the newest of Kyle and Vanessa's grandchildren, a small girl named Patricia Louise Farrow, on his lap in the low stool behind the counter on the day of her first visit to the bakery, and he told her quietly, in the way old men speak to babies, about a grey shepherd who had walked 90 miles home. He died on a Tuesday morning in the winter of his 87th year, in his sleep, in the small apartment above the bookstore. Marcus found him at the appointed 6 o'clock and sat with him for an hour before he called anybody else. He was buried at Maple Grove Cemetery beside Patricia under the maple tree in the plot that faced the small stone with his son's name on it and the smaller stone beside it with the smaller name. His obituary was written by Amelia Voss, who was by then a senior editor at the same Cleveland paper, and it ran on the front page below the fold. The headline was 3 words long. It said, "The Baker Stayed." They tell the story still in Millbrook. Marcus tells it when the customers ask about the small brass tag in the shadow box beside the register, or the framed photograph on the wall behind, or the small rubber ball on the shelf above the counter that nobody has ever moved. Jack Farrow, who is a landscape architect now like his father was, tells it to his own children when they visit Millbrook in the summer, standing in front of the 2 small stones at the back of Maple Grove Cemetery beside the maple tree. Patricia Louise Farrow, who is 12 now and who has decided that when she grows up she's going to run an animal rescue, has already told the story to every one of her classmates and has, twice, brought clippings of Amelia Voss's original article to school for show and tell. The bakery still opens at 4. The stainless steel bowl still sits by the stove. It belongs at present to a hound cross named Wilbur, whom the Bellamy Fund placed with Marcus and his wife in the 20th year of the fund's operations, and who is currently 8 years old and grey around the muzzle, in the same way Scout was grey around the muzzle, though he is his own dog with his own opinions and does not appreciate being compared. The low stool behind the counter is still low. The frame photograph is still framed. The small brass tag still says Scout on one side, and on the other, an address in Cleveland that has not existed for a very long time. And every morning at 4, when the ovens hum on, and the first loaves go in, and the sky over Main Street is still black with the last of the night, Marcus opens the back door of the bakery for a moment, just a moment, to let the cool air in against the warm. He does not do it on purpose. He has told his wife more than once that he does not know why he does it. It is only that when he stands at the wooden bench in the pre-dawn dark and shapes the day's first loaf, there is, on certain quiet mornings, a soft, careful scratch at the door, low down, the kind of scratch that would come from something that did not want to wake anybody. And when he opens the door, of course there is nothing there. There is only the alley and the pharmacy sign across the way, and the awning over what used to be the bookstore, and the first thin edge of the coming morning at the eastern end of the street. But he opens the door anyway, every morning, just in case. Because in Millbrook, Ohio, since a Sunday in the winter of a long time ago, the people know a thing that not every town knows. They know that love, when it is real, does not stop looking for its people. They know that a good dog can walk 90 miles in stages to find the smell of warm bread and a man who used to be his boy's father. They know that a bakery can hold a family together across a grave. They know that some threads take years to find their way back, but that they never, ever break if somebody has the sense to leave a light on and a warm biscuit on the step at 4 in the morning. And if you are listening to this story tonight, wherever you are in the world, then perhaps you know it too. Perhaps you have a scout of your own out there in the world, on his slow, long walk toward you, and he has not arrived yet, but he is coming. Perhaps you have a light you have been forgetting to leave on. Perhaps you have a door you have been forgetting to open. Perhaps tonight is the night you open it. If this story moved you, take a moment to leave a like, to write a short comment about the animal or the person in your own life who found their way back to you against all the odds, and to subscribe to this channel so that the next story to walk out of the dark can find you the way Scout found Frank Bellamy on a rainy morning in Millbrook, Ohio at 4 o'clock, in a life that turned out, at the very last, to be much longer and much kinder than any of them had believed it could be.